This is the Rebel Author Podcast, where we talk about books, business, and occasionally bad words. Hello, Rebels, and welcome to episode 277 of the Rebel Author Podcast. Today, I'm talking to Jennifer Hilt all about how to use tropes, and I will just say we recorded this before I went to Vegas in 2024, so I don't know how sort of up to date or current the comments I make to her about things are, especially because I've changed a bunch of stuff since we spoke. But anyway, this is a fantastic chat and I completely fell in love with her. And I got to meet her in Vegas. So I really hope you guys enjoy this conversation. So comments on the annual episode, Happy New Year episode. Chris said, this community is the best, supportive, inspiring, hilarious, rebellious, and loves the occasional bad word or two, thank goodness. Matt says, always grateful for this deviant. Devious community of rebels. The support for all our nefarious plans could almost melt a cold heart. Mackenzie said, thanks for surprising us and having us on as guests on the podcast. You've built the best and most supportive writing community. I love being part of it. Oh, Happy New Year, Sasha. It's going to be a good one. And Aretos Persephone said, Happy New Year on Instagram. So thank you very much for all those comments. I do love reading them. Please do make sure you pop a comment. Probably Instagram is the best place, I would say. I love seeing what you think of the episodes. So, in personal news and updates then, I am a little bit reluctant to talk too much about what is going on in the background. Suffice to say that I'm looking at offset print runs, which also means I have to look at fulfillment, I have to look at locations, and it is definitely taking up a lot of headspace, a lot more headspace than I probably anticipated. That said, because I now have a team in place, I also am able to create space, which is fantastic. So yesterday, I came back to work on Monday. It is Wednesday, the 8th of January, as I record this. I came back to work on Monday, and I knew Monday was going to be a train crash, and it was. And I had meetings, catch-ups, I dealt with emails, admin. I took approximately 85 fucking kajillion deliveries, and my house is like a war zone, frankly, for cardboard right now. But nonetheless, I managed to get enough done that on Tuesday, I had a whole 3 hours without a single notification. It was the most fucking glorious 3 hours of my life. And surprising exactly nobody, I was then able to sit down, think, and I used the reasoning model, the ChatGPT 1 model, and I talked to it about all kinds of geeky things like, lots and lots of geeky things. And it literally triggered so many ideas for me. I need to remember that I do like to process out loud. As much of an introvert as I am, one of the reasons people do mistake me for an extrovert is because I do kind of externally process. I love to talk and brainstorm and bounce ideas off other people. It's probably why I'm so physical with my research. I love to go, walking or go and visit museums and, be tactile and live an experience in the world and those things. And that's why I travel so much. And those experiences do help to feed into my storytelling. And some of that is the fact that I need to talk out story. I actually have you talked out your story on my sort of pre-drafting checklist. And I forget it every single time because I'm so happy in silence and on my own. And anyway, it was a very good reminder that I do need to talk a little bit more with people about my story, or hell, with GPT. Anyway, it was fantastic. So I have fundamentally changed what I was going to do with my new Gothic romantasy, dark academia Gothic romantasy architecty. But I've changed it for the better and I'm extremely excited. And I'm not going to talk about it right now because until I have the outline finalised and I'm in drafting mode, it still feels like one of those, glass baubles. It's precious. You don't want to shatter it before you have made it kind of, solidified it, I suppose, for want of a better word. So yes, I will talk about that more when I've kind of got it in situ. But I am finally exceptionally excited to write the book. And that is what I've been looking for. I've been waiting, and I was trying to outline, I was sort of thinking, oh, you know, maybe I'm going to do like a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and nothing was really like sticking. Nothing was, you know, really driving my excitement. And then I remembered I should be leading into me. And I realised that there was one part of me that I'd never really done in a fiction book, and that was it. So, I'm so excited. I can't even begin to tell you. I am literally like buzzed, and I just want to get all my admin done and out the way so that I can spend some time outlining. And I think this is also another lesson for me. I am very, very resistant to doing anything unless I'm excited about it. If I don't find joy in it, I've like gone from this feeling beholden to doing things and only doing the things I feel beholden to only doing the things that I feel like joy doing. And so that's why I couldn't grip onto this bloody story. I knew there was a seed in there, and I knew I was excited for it. But I hope that that's maybe a lesson to you guys as well, to really follow joy and to recognise in yourself when you have that, and when you find that joy again, like how much easier it is to just do the fucking work because you're excited to do the work. Anyway, that is a bit of a summary of the absolute carnage that is going on in the background with offset printing, fulfillment. Of course, we're also doing Kickstarter. I actually have spent a fucking frankly obscene number of hours packing art packs, signing cards, signing fucking this, that and the other. My house, God, I can't wait to get my house back. But anyway, I am fulfilling the Kickstarter not next week, but the week after. So that is super exciting. And then it's only really another month. And then, what are we now? January the 8th. So I'm launching the next Kickstarter on March the 4th. So barely 2 months away. I'm just so excited for all of it. Anyway, so that is enough waffling from me. The Rebel of the Week this week is Chris. Chris says, this is another historical rebel because I know you're slowly coming around to historical Sasha. I don't know about that. Okay, let me introduce you to the one and only Gladys Bentley. Gladys was the most famous queer performer during the Harlem Renaissance, a big, beautiful, strong black woman who sang, played the hell out of the piano and gave zero fucks what anybody thought. From an early age, she preferred wearing boys' clothes, and in a later interview said wearing them just felt natural to her. In 1925, she moved to Harlem from Philadelphia and quickly made a name for herself in the buffet flats and rent party circuit. When people would host parties and charge covers to help pay their inflated rents. By 1926, she landed a gig at the Clam House, an iconic queer speakeasy, and there she performed in a man's white tuxedo, fucking hell, complete with top hat, tails, and cane. She vulgarised popular cabaret songs of the day. In one instance, she combined Alice Bluegown and Sweet Georgia Brown into a celebration of anal sex. What a fucking rebel! Another song she was fond of playing, which we think is an original, was Now Nothing Perplexes Like the Sexes. When they switch, you can't tell which is which. Oh my God. She skyrocketed in popularity and expanded her act to include a chorus of drag queens dancing behind her. Langston Hughes, yes, that Langston Hughes, was a huge fan. He wrote that Gladys was an amazing exhibition of musical energy, a large, dark, masculine lady whose feet pounded the floor while her fingers pounded the keyboard, a perfect piece of African sculpture animated by her own rhythm. She also played with the tabloids, telling gossip columnists that she married a woman, and a wealthy white woman at that. Oh my God. I fucking love her. And simultaneously scandalised and enthralled the general public throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Though she'd later have to recant her ways in the 1940s and 50s and present as a more feminine due to the US's push for normalcy, read strict binary gender norms, we must celebrate Gladys as the queer trailblazer she was. A true rebel, I think. So let's all raise a glass to Gladys. She was a fucking legend. What an absolute hero. Look. I'm not a historical fiction fan, but I may have to go Google the hell out of her because wow. If you would like to be a Rebel of the Week, please do send in your story. It can be any kind of rebellion, something big, something small, or something in between. You can email your Rebel story to Becca on rebelauthorpodcast@gmail.com. Huge welcome and thank you to Melanie Reber, Bethany Tucker and Heather Flighty. A huge thank you for joining my Patreon. And of course, an enormous thank you to all of my existing patrons. If you would like to support the show and get early access to all of the episodes, as well as bonus content, you can from as little as $2 a month by visiting patreon.com/Sasha Black. This episode is sponsored by Fictionary. As you know, I was the world's very first Fictionary storyteller coach. And I absolutely loved the course, but rather than me tell you about why I thought it was fantastic, I'm going to let Amy tell you all about why she uses Fictionary. And don't forget, if you would like 25% off Fictionary Storyteller and Storyteller Premium and the certification, you can with code in all caps REBEL25. That's numerical 25, REBEL25.
Hello, I'm Amy Sund, editor at Red Leaf Word Services. Now that your first draft is done, it's time to focus on the big picture elements of your story. Here's where Fictionary can help. Fictionary can track over 30 structural elements per scene. You heard that right. Per scene. It presents these elements in graphs, charts, and color-coded diagrams. It's a fantastic way to pick out weak spots or holes in your story's structure, especially for visual learners. Fictionary is one of the tools I most often suggest to my manuscript evaluation clients. I've used it in my own writing for refining scenes, smoothing out transitions, and seeing where I need to focus my attention. A 14-day free trial is available for new users, perfect for plugging in a short story to see what comes up. Founder Christina Stanley has built a thriving community around the software that is supportive, social, and educational. Come join us and see how Fictionary can help you craft a novel your readers will love.
I think that's enough from me. Let's get on with the episode. Hello and welcome to the Rebel Author Podcast. Today I'm joined by Jennifer Hilt. Jennifer is a USA Today best-selling author of The Trope Thesaurus, an author resource and a 5-book series. She has written 24 books across 4 pen names, plus her urban fantasy trilogy, The Undead Detective. She works as a plotter and concept creator. As a frequent podcast guest, she has appeared on Joanna Penn's The Creative Pen, Brian Cohen's Sell More Books show, Matty Dalrymple's The Indie Author Podcast, and Kobo's Live Writing Life, among many others. She teaches authors about story development in workshops and classes across the US. With degrees in linguistics and literature, Jennifer loves collecting dictionaries in unfamiliar languages, binge-watching Scandi Noir series, and shouting out tropes from the comfort of her couch. I love that. That particularly tickles me pink. What's your favourite trope? Let's start there.
Great. I don't know that it tickles my family that much. I would say they're almost like trope traumatized now because they can't watch anything without like going, oh God, there's this trope in it or that or something. So I feel kind of bad that I've either improved their viewing pleasure or just, totally destroyed it. But my all-time favorite trope has to be amnesia. And what I love about it is I feel like it's just such a totally rich trope that we get used a lot. It's just kind of like, the bonk on the head, character loses memory for a while, then it's convenient, things happen. And then conveniently, when it's time for things to resolve, they get their memory back. But then Severance came along. I don't know if you happen to see that show. And it's a total spin on the amnesia trope. And I was like, yes, it's characters who actually selected to have amnesia to remove some painful memories and how that kind of plays out in their lives. And I was like, oh, that's such a great example of taking an idea and a trope and using it in a new way that has so much more meaning. So I'm pretty obsessed about the amnesia trope and because of Severance. And they have a new season coming out, so I'm so hoping it's good.
Oh, I love that. I also wasn't expecting that. I'm such a basic bitch. My favorite trope is enemies to lovers. I'm basic. Yeah. It's unreal. And I feel like it's my mission in life to write as many enemies to lovers in as many different ways as humanly possible.
that's such an important trope because it's just so fundamental.
Yeah,
And,
yeah. I
I mean,
feel like every romance has a little bit of that anyway.
Mhm. Yes,
Yeah.
because inherently there's inherent conflict in it.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Oh my gosh, we're already into the topic, and I meant to ask you something else first. So,
Okay.
before we dive into the topic, would you like to tell everyone a little bit more about you? Like, what is your journey? How did you end up
Yeah,
talking about tropes as well as writing a bunch of fiction?
right. Um, I've always been interested in how stories are put together. Like even as a kid, I was like, but not, in a sophisticated way, but just kind of wondering like why I liked some stories more than others. Or like I remember noticing like, oh, Little Women is really like Little House on the Prairie. Why is that? Just kind of like things like that. But I was lucky enough that I could go to a public library and just read whatever I wanted. I grew up in the 70s and 80s and like nobody cared. Like, it was such a neat time in some ways. So I've just always been a really big reader, and I never really considered that an author was a job I could do. I just would make up stories on my head or for myself, but I didn't know anybody who did that. And so I did other things while I was learning about writing and going to graduate school and things like that. But it was during when I had kids, actually, I started really writing fiction because I realized, oh, I'm never going to get more time. And it's always like, oh, wait till this settles down or that. And then, my oldest son developed type 1 diabetes at 5, which is a very stressful, time consuming, serious condition. And ironically, it was that made me realize I'm not ever going to have more time, and I need to escape, but I can't really go anywhere. So then I really kind of buckled down and just started working on lots of different and working in different genres of romance and things like that. And then fast forwarding to the pandemic, where I was doing some teaching and helping other writers like formulate their ideas and understand story structure. And in that process, I realized, oh, we needed a common language to talk about how to develop these ideas. And I would say, oh, that, and the authors would be like, it's a trope, but I want to write a good story. And so then that made me think about, all right, but we need a common language, but then there's this concern. So what is that all about? So luckily I spent a lot of time in the pandemic, like just deep diving, reading a bunch of different stuff of genres and, everything from like, super great trashy stuff to like, literary fiction that won a Nobel Prize, and realizing, oh my God, there's tropes everywhere. It's not just in this kind of in like fan fiction or anything like that. It's like they're literally in everything, and I even see them now in commercials, which is kind of funny. But anyway, so that kind of started me down this path of like just looking and trying to realize what they were and how they're so powerful and how we can use them as authors in telling stories without feeling like embarrassed or ashamed or anything like that. And just like they have this power, why don't we tap into it and use it to create our best work?
Oh, I like there's about 4 million things I want to ask you about. This
That's
is this, yeah. Oh my God, I'm gonna love this chat. So tropes are like my favorite thing ever, and I start with tropes when I start writing. And I used to be one of those people that was like, oh, tropes. But do you know what it was? I actually didn't really know what I was talking about, and I had no idea what a trope really was. And it
Me
wasn't
neither at the
until
beginning.
right, and it
Yeah,
wasn't until well, I'm going to ask you about that, but it wasn't until I understood that tropes are the language that readers speak in that I
absolutely.
realized how important they were. So
Mhm.
I'm going to ask you two questions. The first one is, what is a trope? And the second one is, why do so many writers hate them?
First of all, like I had to come to a definition of what a trope was when I started this work, because there's so many different it's strange. There's like a lot of things floating around out there, but I needed something to like nail down that I could apply to, a vast field. And I decided that a trope was an easily understood term that like anybody, if you have a sixth grade reading level, you're going to understand what that is. That it's generally a neutral storytelling idea. So it's not something that has an inherent value to it. It's just an idea. And the other thing I discovered is that tropes are really about relationships. And so those are the three things that I felt like, okay, those are what tropes are. And I distinguish them from stereotypes or cliches in my work, because I really feel like stereotypes and cliches are really fixed and they're negative. And so it's harder to develop, like one of the examples I use is it's hard to develop a character a dumb jock, where you could have a character who's an athlete and they can have, learning challenges, or they could have anything. But it doesn't, but using a dumb jock as a character is a lot more difficult to develop than just having attributes of a character.
Okay, so I'm guessing that you have read Theodora Taylor and Jennifer Lynn Barnes and
Yes.
listened to all the. Okay, so I am forever trying to piece you three together because I feel like you are the three pillars of people who talk about something that is the same concept.
Uh-huh.
And for me, the way that I've distilled it down is that we're talking about emotional resonance. We're talking about the elements of book that are emotional resonance. But and the way that I have kind of structured it in my brain is that there are major tropes and minor tropes. And kind of the minor tropes are what a lot of Jennifer and Theodora talk about in terms of like butter or universal fantasy and the stuff you kind of sprinkle through the book. And a lot of your thesauri are kind of talking about the slightly bigger ones with like internal stakes and conflict and stuff like that. But I would love to hear from your perspective if I've got that completely wrong, or if
Right.
like do you delineate between kind of major tropes and minor tropes and this kind of stuff, or are they all one big
Right.
bag to you?
For me, and I love it that we're all talking about similar things from different angles, because that's what creativity is and that's what writing is. So everybody should feel free to like take from whatever of the work that we're all doing works for them. I'm not a person who's like, oh, you need to follow like my method or anything like that. It's just like, if it's helpful for you, take what's helpful and move on. I really feel like, to me, I feel like tropes are just a big bag, like a big goodie bag I have of toys. And in my mind, you can do whatever with them. It's just really how you're combining them is, I think, is really largely what the powers are with tropes. And the other thing that I really like about them is that they can be used, like, you don't need a separate set of tropes for, at least in my mind, the primary characters and the secondary characters, or, you can just do with them different things. I think the important thing to understand is that they play different tropes they can play a lot of different roles in talking about relationships. And so it's kind of important for us to like think about what those relationships are and like what the stakes are and those kind of things. So I don't know if that helps answer your question.
Well, I just find it interesting to think about it from all the different perspectives, and to like, I would love to interview Jennifer and Theodora and ask the same question to them.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, right. Right.
so
Yeah, for me, I would say for me, it's the tropes are very integral, I would say. Like when I'm working on a story, do start with thinking of like, what are the characteristics of these characters? So for me, it feels more like um, foundational as opposed to like a thing that you would use after or like later in later stages.
do
That's
you
maybe
feel do you feel like tropes have an innate story structure in them?
I do, yes. I feel like they absolutely can, because, and I think that's really like a thing that writers don't use them enough. Like we'll mention, like, say, a character is an orphan, right? Especially in fantasy and sci-fi, we got lots of orphans running around, but we don't always understand that like there's so many things tied to being an orphan with that vulnerability that we can develop through the story that will even give us more conflict by tying it to different tropes. So I feel like it's not enough to just mention this, that about a character as we're starting out about them. We need to keep showing how those tropes are in action as they face conflict throughout the story. So for me, I think, developing them in that way is almost like breaking down a scene, and that you're going to use the trope in different ways, and, show the trope in different ways through your story. And so the characters realize, oh, yeah, that's part of their journey.
Okay, so let's go deeper. Let's say
Yeah.
we're going to do forbidden romance and we're going to do it across like a duology or a trilogy. What
Yeah.
does the manifestation of forbidden romance look like across three books? Because you can't just repeat the same thing, right?
Right.
Okay.
And that's really true. And there's a lot. I have a lot of thoughts on this topic. So one of the thoughts I have about forbidden romance is there usually has to be, well, first of all, we obviously have to be talking about really high stakes. It has to be like, really really conflict ridden, and it can't just be there's a minor reason why they can't be together. It has to really matter. And the other thing that I think is important about it is you need to think of like what other tropes you're going to be combining it with. And like, so a lot of times, like forbidden romance, there's also like an element of enemies to lovers or opposites attract, or they could be like, there's there's some element of forced proximity. Like there's other tropes that we're putting in there with it. So the challenge, I think, when we're trying to write like a duology or a trilogy is that we need to keep raising the stakes and having them discover like new challenges. Well, so we're not just like going on a repeat. And I think that's really tough. And one way that I've seen it done well is, if you use a like a love triangle in it, to help with that also. But then you have to like make sure you're not a lot of them, there's always one character in a love triangle that's weaker, and you're like, they're not, they're not really going to choose that one, so it's like really trying to dig down and find what are the really high stakes for this, and how can I put the characters like back up against the wall the most.
Okay, I realise I haven't even looked at my questions. Asked you a single question I was supposed to ask you yet, because this is just so interesting. I am going to ask you some of the actual questions I prepped you for. Okay, so science fiction and fantasy, that's what we're going to focus on, which is great. That's what I write. So, I write romantasy. What are readers expecting? Like, what are the tropes that are really big and popular, and how do we find out what they are?
Um, well, one of the ways that we can find out what they are is by like reading in our genres and knowing kind of what other things are going on. But that's not the only thing we need to do, but it's just good to be aware of who else is in your um, author neighborhood, as my friend Nat talks about. There's some tropes that we just keep seeing again and again in fantasy and sci-fi, which I love. And one of them I really believe is the journey or quest. Almost everybody in a sci-fi or fantasy, they're going on there's a mission, or, there's some kind of thing that has to happen. And so that's like one thing that we see. Forced proximity is another one we see a lot, because we need to have a reason where we can put the characters together in a pressure cooker where they're, interacting kind of like almost a popcorn. Other tropes that I really tend to think of, what else was I thinking of? Oh, fish out of water. That's a great one because it just provides so much awesome conflict of like, we don't have the world's most prepared warrior. Oh, what a surprise, and then in that journey, they have found family, which is another huge trope that I think we see in fantasy a lot is, coming, whatever their situation from, they're going to find their people on the way. So those are some that I keep seeing again and again. And I think they're endlessly combined and create new things. Like I just read recently, what was it, the name of it that I liked so much? Oh, The Last Blood Carver, Vanessa Lee. I don't know if you happen to read that. But anyway, it was like I was so happy because it was like, oh, cool. She just like took all these, those tropes that I just mentioned, but combined them in different ways. And it's I think it's a duology. The second book is coming out, but I just really enjoyed it. And yeah, and it definitely was, again, forbidden romance.
Okay, so Vanessa Lee, what was the title? I got her name.
The Last Blood Carver.
The Last Blood Carver. Okay, I'm gonna have to have a look at that one. Okay, one of the things that let's say we've got a newer writer and they've accepted finally that tropes are a good thing. The next question that they all come up with is, well, how do you make a trope fresh?
Right. This is true. I think the thing that it's important to understand is that we need to think about what is the actual power of the trope. And the power of the trope is like something that readers recognize and that they can emotionally resonate with. And I think tropes work really well when we think of that writing mantra, complex characters, simple plot. Because what we're trying to do is, and that's what tropes can be like the superpower for, is we can create those complex characters by adding, like, when I'm working with creating characters, the minimum I feel like I want to see is like 3 tropes for that character. But in reality, when you read a really, really great book, you think about it, you realize, oh my gosh, there's way more than 3 tropes defining this one character. There's like probably 15, but they're just like little different parts that are pulled in, almost like if you're, putting together a stew. And so I feel like you don't have to rush out and think of how I can do a big twist on this trope. Think of how you can take your characters and create meaningful elements with them. And then you can use that twisting in like world building and situations and things like that. But it's like, we don't have to be in such a total hurry to make something that's so, we want to tap into what the recognizable and the relatable. is. And then we can use our like creativity for the world building. And that's what like I think really cements readers. But they like to have a character that they can recognize. So it's not like you have to, yeah.
No, no, sorry. I just find you so interesting. One of the things that I have started doing, which I only started doing because I watched other authors doing it, is it's always bad to confess
The
this, but
nature of
like,
it's the nature of our business though, is that's how we work is
right?
yeah.
No, no. Well, the thing is, so what this thing is I'm just like making shit up. Like, and obviously that is
Yeah.
partly our job, but I mean it in terms of the tropes. So, like,
Uh-huh.
for example, grumpy gargoyles is not a trope, but when I said that out loud on social media, a bunch of people went and brought the book. So I kind of feel like,
Yeah.
or
So
like,
that so you
sorry, go ahead, please go ahead. Yeah.
no. Okay. No, so grumpy gargoyle to me says basically you've got a protector and you have some kind of alcohol. So to me, it sounds like, oh, you have twisted two tropes into something new that people can identify, and yet they're, you know what I mean? Like, oh, they totally reacted to that in the best possible way that you want. So I think that that is actually a better example than what I said of a way to do it. But you've like you're fusing those elements into something new but recognizable. Because like if you said, okay, I have a
Okay.
protector who's an alpha hole, okay, like sort of like 9 million other authors, but you say grumpy gargoyle and it's like, oh, you can still hook on to those elements, but you've just rotated it slightly and added. I think it's the details that people are kind of either afraid of with tropes. Like my kind of mission in life is I want people to feel like manipulate the hell out of tropes.
Okay.
Don't
So,
feel like they're a precious thing that you have to be like, oh, I no, like take what you need from it and pull them all apart,
So another one that I can give you is like, how like in a lot of contemporary romance, brooding man, it's usually like a
Mhm.
6'4" man who's built like a brick
Yeah,
shit house and a 5 foot nothing girl. So I can't
right.
do that because I write lesbian romance. But what I did
Right.
do was have a 6 foot vampire and a 5 foot hunter. So I had,
Okay.
right? And like the same thing happened. I described it like that, and people were like, because it's the same trope, but like without saying the trope. And so that's what I mean by like making shit up. But think what I didn't do was connect the fact that actually it was little and large was the same. It's the same trope. It's just applied to queer people. Um, what mistakes do you see people making with tropes?
I feel like people don't make them their own enough. They don't add enough detail. So like what you were just saying, like you want to add for those two characters, I'm sure you add a whole bunch of other details. So it's not just, a vampire and it's not just a hunter. And so just don't be afraid to make them really that's where you can go in and make them really personal and memorable, like your grumpy gargoyles. And I think that is really the biggest mistake I see is people feel like it's like a trope, and I'm like they're kind of almost afraid to like touch it in a way. And I want people to feel like bend it, break it, move it around, do a bunch of stuff with it. Um, have it like work for you, because there's not a lot of things in life that we can, we don't have to pay for these rights or anything like that. It's like a tool that we have to reach readers. And so make it work for you, make it do your, as much heavy lifting as you can with getting them hooked into a story like that.
Hmm. Okay. So what's the difference between like a person trope and a change trope?
Yeah, for me, it depends on the reason. That's one thing I did that is because when you look up on the internet, like for tropes, you're going to get these big alphabetical lists. And in my mind, and because I like language and, doing this linguistics degree, which really I didn't thought I would ever get that much use out of it. Now I get to play with it all the time. Um, I thought, well, what if we looked at tropes instead of just like in alphabetical ways and we put them in different areas? So like Persian tropes would be like I've been talking about, like orphan or loner, protector. Those are like ways we can, it could be anything. Could be like royalty, alcohol. Just like ways we can use to describe characters. And then change tropes, I kind of use as if I'm thinking about like, what kind of plots do I want to have? What kind of like conflict do I want to put these characters through? And it's like a big basket, or a big bucket. There's lots of different change, and it's not like they're necessarily like different ones. It's just kind of how I use it. if I'm thinking of like, oh, working on character or kind of working on plot, it's kind of how I've tried to like offer some ways for people to think about tropes with that way. Like I also talk about, oh, you could use tropes as like primary storylines or like secondary storylines. So just kind of like they can be used in different ways. It's just trying to get people to feel more comfortable with thinking about how do I want to use them and what do I want them to do? And I think the best way, it can feel like really clunky and, people are worried like, oh, am I going to do it wrong? The best way to really learn about tropes is when everything you read, everything you watch, just start thinking of like, what are they doing? How are they using tropes in this, and did I like it? Would I do something different? And it's also really fun.
um, okay, so how can they help us outline? How can we? So you mentioned sort of like an A plot and like a B plot and things like that, like or subplots, whatever you want to call them.
Sure.
How do we outline using tropes?
Yeah. Well, one thing that we hadn't mentioned yet that I think is there's actually two things that we haven't mentioned that I think are really important when we talk about outlining. And one is knowing, if you're just writing your first story and you just want to write the book of your heart, you just want to write something, then just go ahead and do that. But if you're like really like, okay, I want to hit a commercial market, I want to publish this, I want to have like a direction to go with this, then you really need to know what your genre is and what the expectations of that genre are. And I feel like the genre expectations, along with knowing what your character goal, motivation, and conflict and tropes all like work together, kind of like the 3 points of a triangle to help you get like, oh, okay, I can come up with an outline for this like, vague idea I have that's kind of hanging out there that, you can get started in the beginning, but then you're like trying to figure out how to get through the middle to the end. So I think using knowing what the things are expected in your genre, and then going after the goal, motivation, and conflict of like, what do my characters want? How can I pick things that are measurable so that I know what they are? So like the reason why I'm really kind of strict about the idea of goals being meaningful and measurable is because, especially with romance writers, we were like, oh, we want them to be happy, we want them to be in love. Those are super hard to measure. But that's why we see tons of stories about, oh, getting an old house, picking up a bakery, going on a quest. Those are things at the end and through the story, and at the end of the story, we can see, was this character successful or not? And those really concrete story posts also give us great conflict that we can put in the middle there. So we can still build an emotional story, but we need to have the characters do things. And so that's why I talk about like goals being meaningful and measurable. And I really think that's important. And then the motivation is like, the story, like the theme or kind of what is the character's why. And conflict is really the most important of the three to me, because it's how are we going to make it as difficult as possible for the characters to get to the goal. So I kind of, when I'm outlining, I try to think about those three things and think, what's going to be happening in the story? What are the challenges that my characters are going to face? And how can I make it seem like there's no way they're going to get through this?
So let's talk about that conflict then. How can we develop conflict using tropes? Like, how can we use tropes to build more conflict than we've already got?
Sure. So like, for example, when we're talking about your stories, you have, so your two, a lot, I think it's really important that the two main characters be connected in some way. So beyond like, whatever their romantic relationship is, it really helps if there's like a thing they both want, particularly because then you're going to have those characters in conflict in that way, either fighting to get it. Only one of them's going to, one of them's going to be happy in the end, these kind of things. So I feel like the idea of the MacGuffin is something that we see a lot, especially in fantasy and sci-fi, and it's like that quest thing. And if you're not familiar with the MacGuffin, a perfect example of it is the old Indiana Jones Raiders of the Lost Ark. The Lost Ark, that's a MacGuffin. It's a thing everybody wants and that they're searching for. And we see that, in all kinds of fantasy and sci-fi, because it's just such a great story vehicle to help us get to hang our conflict on. So like something like the Hunger Games, it's like, her surviving those games, and yet the conflict of people she cares about not having to kill them and things like that provided the structure for that emotional experience. So I really think thinking about like what are some tangible things that are going to happen in my story are a really important way we can use the journey tropes to get us from one end to the other with conflict.
You mentioned relationships as well. So can we use tropes to create conflict between in relationships?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So like when you talked about like fated mate, opposites attract, I mean, the reason why we keep seeing and enemies to lovers, the reason why we keep seeing those again and again is because there's conflict inherent in it. So we don't have to like, do a big setup for the readers. They already know there's some problem in there that they have to overcome. And that's, kind of keeping them guessing of how you're going to keep teasing that out is what keeps it fresh.
Okay. So I want to come back to the like duology trilogy and go into a bit
Oh,
more
right. Yeah.
detail there for entirely selfish reasons. So what, like, let's say it's a Forbidden Lovers.
Okay.
Um, and compare what would happen with a duology versus a trilogy. Now, would you, so like I'm never really sure, like, do you take it up to like the 75% mark? So let's say in book one you take it up to 75% of like a plot outline. So Dark Night of the Soul with Forbidden Lovers, I guess like the cliffhanger is they break up. What happens in
Right.
book two? Do they go back to being Forbidden Lovers? Like, do you start from 75% and then inch your way up towards, the 100% mark?
Right.
But then what happens in book three?
Right.
What? So talk to me about that in terms of like, yeah, like innate story structure, so inciting incident, midpoint, that kind of stuff, versus the trope structure across the trilogy. And then let's talk about a duology.
Sure. Um, I think the way that I see that I personally find, I mean, I'll say that I personally find stories where you have like the whole thing resolved in one book are generally the most satisfying to me because you put all that juice in one book, right? But as writers, we don't always do that. We have to like we want to stretch out and like, create other things. So I think in order to get through a duology or trilogy, you just need to have a lot more conflict. And by that you need to have there. It's not just the conflict between those two main characters. You need to have basically conflict with their secondary characters and with their families and with it's really Donald Moss used to talk about conflict on every page, and it seems like how could you possibly do that? But then when you read some like really like this isn't a fantasy author, but if you want to see somebody who does conflict on every page, Tana French, her Murder Squad, Dublin Murder Squad series, I will like worship at that lady's altar for the rest of my life because she literally does conflict on every page and she has forbidden lovers in there and it's just like so much great stuff, but she's able to like really drill down in relationships and see where it's not your story isn't just about those two characters. You're going to have a whole bunch of other conflict in there. And so it's kind of like realizing how to take that and expand it so that they have other aspects of their life that are putting pressure on them too, not just this one relationship. So I would think in terms of like having more than one storyline. So you're like going to solve one problem at the end of book one. You're going to have like another big problem at the end of book two, and then there's this old big overarching problem that you'll solve at the end of book three. And if often we see like, especially my brain is all very focused on mystery thriller lately because that's kind of the next book that I'm working on. But one of the ways we see this done is something about the one of the main characters' identities. So there's like that, and if you think of also like the Sookie Stackhouse books,
Oh, I
that was kind of
loved them,
I know, so great, right? And it's the same, and hers are really
except the
great.
last one. Did you read them all?
I read to like 10, so I don't think
Okay.
I read the last
I
one.
binge read the end. I very rarely read more than one book in a series. Like it has to be
Right.
really good to hook me.
Yeah.
And I binge read and devoured that series right up until 150 pages into the last book, the 13th book. And the writing was on the wall with who she was going to
Mhm.
end up. And I was
Yep.
so mad. I literally threw the book in the bin. I was furious. I felt so betrayed. And I never finished
Mhm.
the series because of
Yeah.
that. But I will not say a bad word about the rest. Like all
Right.
prior 12 books were incredible. I absolutely loved them. But yeah, sorry,
Right.
that's my mini rant.
No, no, but no, and that is a really interesting. I agree about that because I knew that yes, she ends up. If people are watching this, big spoiler alert. It's been out for a long time. If you haven't read it, you need to go read it now. That series, but it's not who she spends the majority of the book going back and forth between two major characters. So for her to pick a third very ancillary character to wind up
Yeah.
with was, I
Yeah.
think, yes, a disappointment. And Harris had said like, oh, she planned all along for her to wind up with him, but I was kind of
Why?
like.
Nobody even liked him.
Yeah, I agree. It was a really interesting choice. But that's a good series for us to talk about in terms of so how she because she went even way farther than three books, right? With really going back and forth with these. Well, it was basically
It was love triangle, wasn't it? That was the
yeah,
trope.
love triangle, right. But it was more than, but like within love triangle, she had other tropes in there because there were like the tropes for her relationship with Bill, and then there were tropes for her relationship with Eric, and they weren't exactly the same, and yet those two guys hated each other. So it was like you could really see how there were all the various tropes that she was like a master. And she had, I think it was book 5 in there. She had the amnesia one, remember, where Eric loses his memory.
Oh,
And I was
yes.
like, oh my God, that's so amazing, because we get to have this experience of him as a character. And then at the end of it, it's like, she takes it away. Like,
Yeah, and they have to fall in love all over again.
yes, yes. So, I in thinking about your story, in thinking about your question, I'm thinking about how Harris, did it with that series. And she really did it by develop. So, you had like problems with Suki's work life, problems with Suki's family, her problems with all the various paranormal communities. Like, I think the way she kept it going was just kind of really that idea of conflict at every page. She never had a breather.
Okay, have you watched Emily in Paris?
I have not.
Oh, it's because I really wish you'd watched it because I just shat the bed over it and I've had a massive tantrum and I've said to Chloe, I'm not watching, Chloe's my wife, sorry. I said I'm not
Uh-huh.
watching another season. So I've watched 4 seasons of this
Yes.
bloody
Yeah.
show.
Yeah.
And at the end of every season, she pulls the love interests apart. And like they've both gone off and dated other people, like, and then they've come
Uh-huh.
back together and then they've been pulled apart. And I literally said to Chloe, if they don't get together at the end of this season, I'm done. So
Right.
what I'm curious, and I am done, and I will not watch another series, is shown another season now. But why? Right? Because
Mhm.
what's the like what is it where that fails, because
Mhm.
Charlene Harris didn't fail and kept me reading
Right.
all the way through, but
Right.
Emily in Paris has pissed me off for the last time. So
Yeah.
where is the line? How can that happen? What is the mistake there?
Right. I haven't seen Emily in Paris, but you
Yeah,
can't escape it because it's everywhere. My guess is, did you ever see the Bridget Jones books or movies?
I saw the movies.
Yeah. I think my guess is it's kind of what I love the first one. I thought the first one was great. And I'm a huge Jane Austen fan, so it was an easy sell, but there were a lot of great things. The second one was like you basically just took the same story and put it and they just returned it. And I think probably the third, and then they're going to make a fourth, is probably going to be very similar. So I think readers and viewers are more sensitive about that. And some people are like, there's different reasons why people watch or consume our stuff, right? Sometimes people want complete escape. Sometimes people like want to have something on while they fold laundry or check the phone. And I'm guessing that the Emily in Paris just did a lot of repeats of what they did originally, and that I think happens often with series where they're so successful with the first thing and they're afraid to do anything different. So they're just going to like, oh, these are all the parts people loved. We'll just do that again. And
Mm.
you can only, it's kind of, Robert, the guy who, I'm trying to remember, he wrote the
McKee.
screen. Yes. Remember how he talks about that basically, repetition. He said, other than sex, everything in life gets more dull with repetition. Then he uses the example of first ice cream cone tastes great. Second's like, okay. Third, you're like, gross. And I think there's that element to it that there probably aren't enough stakes. Like you figured out they're just kind of like doing the same thing again and again. And maybe they're changing it up with location and cool, costumes and things like that. But there's nothing really new at risk for her, is my guess, not having seen it, but just kind of from what I've heard.
Okay. Oh, this is so interesting. um okay, what what is your definition of angst? And how can we use
Mm,
tropes to create angst?
I love it. Nobody's ever asked me that before. What an awesome question. Um, I think angst is actually a really great word to use because it's not used as much as conflict. And conflict is kind of like almost like the word depression or love. It gets thrown around so much, it's hard to feel like it still has value to it. I think angst has a lot of I think angst has an element of secret in it, and we haven't talked about secret and scars, which are like two of my other favorite tropes. And I feel like angst has an element of that because there's this element of uncertainty, and there's like an element of a question of self-worth. Like it's beyond just I think that's a really great way to think about conflict. Actually, now you got me thinking about that. So I would say that when I think about angst, I think about a character having self doubt, and I would think of them as relating as working on a character to the secret and scar tropes, which I think are so important and huge in stories. And looking at something like the Sookie Stackhouse books, those things were packed with secrets and scars. I mean, fantastic. Like, and even as we were talking about, far into the series, we were still uncovering parts of it, that character. Even the idea that like she's basically like lost royalty. Like, I didn't
Yes.
think about that at first, right? I didn't think about that at all until I started to do that work. And then I'm like, it's like, that's so fascinating that like, that's one of the reasons why we like her is we're on this journey, like for her to figure out her identity. So I guess angst is a way that we can kind of quantify uncertainty, and that's really what we want.
Okay, cool. I ask because I have been told that I write very angsty romance.
Mhm. Oh, cool.
And lesbians love angst. And I'm like,
Mhm.
cool. I don't really know what that is or how I'm doing that. And
Yeah.
so obviously I want to know because I want to be able to do it more. And I
Yes.
wondered if it was kind of like the level of like emotional fraughtness,
I
like
believe. Mhm.
conflict in and that's when you were talking I was like yes exactly it's conflict but like a niche portion of conflict that's like
Mhm.
emotional fraughtness.
Mhm.
um and so yeah, and the funny thing is one of the things that I do incredibly well is write secrets.
Yeah.
So there you go,
They're,
like I feel like
yeah.
you have just like that is how it's working, that's how it comes from the secrets. Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Those are
No,
so important. And like, and since I'm spending a lot of time thinking about that lately, it's like, there's that like another one of those writer maxims like, oh, give every character a secret. And yes, I believe like in the kind of bold letters, that's true. But it's also like not just any secret. So like one thing I was thinking about, and people tend to think of like, well, what if I were, so say you're writing a lighter fantasy series. You don't want to have your characters have all these like they're not going to be these deep, dark secrets, which people tend to think of as secrets, but secrets could be anything. But then I was thinking, like, yeah, so I thought, what if you had a character who hated chocolate? How could that be a secret? How could that cause conflict? And then I thought, oh, Charlie in the Chocolate Factory. What if he hated chocolate? He was allergic to it. And then yet this whole like he gets this golden ticket and it's just, you know what I mean? It was like, oh, that made it that this scene all of a sudden it made me think of like, oh yeah, it's just another way that people can use secrets and that it has to be meaningful. Those secrets need to be meaningful for your characters, but they can be anything. It doesn't have to be, oh, that you had, I mean, we see Secret Baby all the time. I love Secret Baby. There's so many different uses for it, but it doesn't have to be Secret Baby. It can be it just needs to fit your genre and your story. But secrets are incredibly important because if you say that, like that emotion, you're trying to like protect that emotional vulnerability. And I think it doesn't matter who we are, we all have that. That's something we can all relate to.
how can we use tropes in our marketing?
Yeah. I think that readers are super, like we talked about, they're super savvy about them. So it's helpful to know, like for you. So like forbidden romance is huge for yours, right? Is that
Yes,
what we were
yeah.
that was,
Well,
yeah.
yeah, so I'm very good at writing enemies to lovers, but like I've literally done that like 14 million times. So I'm like, I am
Right.
determined to write something different with this next book. So I think
Right.
I'm going with forbidden romance.
Okay, yeah. But you could still have other, I mean, it could be forbidden romance, but it could start out with an element of enemies to lovers in it, or they could have, had like a back, they could have had like, I don't know if there's possible to have them like have known each other before or something like that. But there's always like great things you can do with backstory to create more conflict. And that's one thing that I think is kind of neat about reunion stories is that, or redemption stories, also is that you like you're pulling the past into the present, and so
Mm.
you have like another layer of conflict to go through with that. But now I just lost my train of thought. What did you ask me again? I'm
Marketing.
sorry. Oh, marketing. Yes. Okay. So I would think about like what are really so if you use a whole bunch like let's just use The Witcher as an example. Um, that had so many tropes in it. I always say I think it would be easier to figure out what tropes weren't in it than what were. But what it was really marketed as quest story and as you say, a kind of grumpy gargoyle in the terms of he was a protector but reluctant about that. And those were like the things
Bodyguard,
in
kind of. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Bodyguard.
Yes, bodyguard, right. Those were the tropes that we saw and that readers or viewers really responded to, plus all these really good looking people. And I think that it's like you want to think about what are like the true emotional elements, what are the relationships that your story really boils down to, and if you can pull those out as tropes, that is like a way to hook your readers and like make them realize, oh, okay, there's like real conflict in this. So and we see them, the obvious places we see them are in like in blurbs and our covers and like any kind of ads, things like that. It's totally popular now to call them out, as we know, and that used to not be a thing that happens. So I think it's just they're using them as signposts, as you mentioned earlier, to your readers, that there's elements in the story that you love, so come check out this book, and there's other things in here you don't know about yet, so you should come and find out what those are. So I think it's kind of using them as a way to entice readers to look in your stuff.
Amazing. Well, this is the Rebel Author Podcast. So tell everyone about a time you unleashed your inner rebel.
I went to school in Western New York in the mid 80s in a very small town, which I hated. And like I said before, I was a really big reader, and we read like every dead white male, depressing, misogynistic author there was to read. I mean, it was just like nonstop. And we had the principal was filling in for our English class one day. And so I asked, like, oh, how come we don't read any female authors? And he told me, young lady, when there are female authors that are worth reading, we will tell you who those are to read. I know. It's like so shocking now, right? But at the time it was like, it was a different time, the mid 80s, And I was really embarrassed and like hurt that, of course, but I was also like pissed. And I noticed that one of the other English teachers, a female who was super awesome, but she just kind of kept her head down and did her stuff. She was reading a book privately that was peeking out of her bag called The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. And I was like, oh, what's that? And she's like, oh, I'm returning it to the library. You got to get it and check this out. And so for me, that was kind of an example of that book just like blew my mind, because at the time that it came out, I had read nothing like that. And it really made me realize you just need to keep looking and be an advocate of change starts little. And at the time, like now we think, oh, Handmaid's Tale, of course, that should be something everybody was talking about. It was not that way. When it first came out at a public high school in a small town. But I think it's just kind of like trying to let yourself not be afraid is my best example of being a rebel, is just to kind of move beyond the anxiety to let yourself be true.
Oh, I love that so much. I'm really upset that we've come to the end. But it went so fast, literally so fast. Would you like to tell everyone where they can find out more about you, your books, and like anything else you want to add?
Sure. Yeah, if you visit my website at www.jenniferhilt.com, you could sign up for my newsletter, which would be awesome, because I send things out of like when I have new books coming out, and when I'm publishing stuff on like Substack, things like that. And when I'm teaching classes and going to workshops and conferences. Other ways you can check me out is I'm on YouTube and Facebook. So yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And of course, a giant thank you to all of the show's listeners and all of the show's patrons. If you would like to get early access to all of the episodes, you can do so by visiting patreon.com/Sasha Black. I'm Sasha Black. You were listening to Jennifer Hilt, and this was the Rebel Author Podcast. Next week, I'm talking to Melissa McTernan, who is more commonly known as Laurie Gilmore, the smash hit superstar of the Pumpkin Spice Cafe. So join me next week for that. Don't forget to tune in and subscribe on your podcatcher. And when you have a moment, please leave a review.